And I'll speak to neurodiverse couples out there because we're going to jump into chapter 5, or 5 and 6, which is the responsibility chapters. And before we even knew that we were a neurodiverse couple, actually, I'll go back to our premarital counseling. So I was going to be going to graduate school. I always knew I was going to work outside the home. That's just who I am, and that's what I want to do. And my husband's okay with that. We're okay with that. But in our premarital counseling, the pastor said to me in front of Dan, well, if you're going to work outside the home, you can't expect Dan to do any house chores or any work.
Oh my gosh.
Asking him to do anything that is your role, it was taking away from being in the home. So if the two of you are okay with you working, but you are going to take on still doing all the chores and all the thing and not asking him to do anything of that, then that's godly and that's okay. So we kind of both like, okay, and like took that. And then enter into our story. I have 2 kids that are neurodivergent, one ADHD and one on the spectrum. So that was a little bit difficult with 5 and 7 therapy sessions a week that they were doing, plus working, plus trying to do everything. And there was one day I was like, I'm going to have a mental breakdown if we do not change up how this house works. Like, I am telling you, I am hanging on by a thread. And he's like, well, I thought you signed on to that with the pastor. Like, I never said that's what I wanted to do, but it was like, it came to us and it looked like you signed on. So he was like, well, of course, let's relook at it. So here I am was thinking I couldn't even ask because I signed on the dotted line and shook the hand in front of the pastor. If I was going to work outside the home. But because of which we didn't know about his neurodiversity then, but when we were talking it through, he was like, I know I can only do one major thing because I just can't remember everything. And he's like, if I took over cooking, would that feel equal? And I said, now cooking means planning and grocery shopping. And he said, yes. And I was like, deal, done. Hallelujah. That feels fair and equitable to me because I have a good executive function. I can handle multiple things, prioritize things, call things, set up appointments. He doesn't have great executive function, but he wants to cook. He likes to cook and he can form his list and go to get that. And we talk about the menu, like we share the mental load of the menu or whatever, but then he executes and he's the hunter gatherer. So when that changed, it shifted everything of wow, I can have more in my head. So that's so important. Your chapter talks about not only mental load, but emotional load and sharing that responsibility. So I really want to spend the rest of our time in partnership and dependability, responsibility, and how important that is. So where would you like to start that discussion? And I'm going to be looking over my notes and picking out some quotes from your book.
Well, let me just tell you that this was actually our biggest surprise in the data. Because, when you do a survey, you kind of think, okay, I'm pretty sure I know what we're going to find. And then you have this moment of panic where what if we don't find it? But no, it's like, I'm pretty sure we're going to find it. And we did. On the whole, everything that we thought we were going to find, we pretty much did because we weren't discovering anything earth shattering. We were just putting it all in one place. But what we were surprised by was the magnitude of this. Because if you ask people, what are the main things that couples fight about? They tend to list 2 things, right? Do you know what do they tend to say?
Well, it's usually with sex and money or sex and in-laws. Those are usually the ones that come up.
Yeah. Right. And we measured marital satisfaction on a scale of 1 to 100. Okay. And most people are sitting between 60 and 90. So there's not a lot of people sitting around 20. So there's not a lot of movement. Most people are in that area, right? And if you have money problems, that decreases marital satisfaction by about 5 points. So it's important. It's not huge, but it is important. If you go from having sex several times a week to only having sex once a month or less, you decrease marital satisfaction by about 10 points. Okay. So that's even more important. But if you go from doing 50% of the housework to doing 90% of the housework, you decrease marital satisfaction by 30 points. That is huge. And we had no idea that it mattered that much. But of everything that we studied, this was the big thing that is hurting couples is when housework is not even, and it can't always be even because of people's work schedules, right? When Keith was working ridiculous hours, it made sense for me to do most of the housework, and that's fine. But over time, if someone is doing 100% or 90%, it isn't sustainable long-term. Even if you're a stay-at-home parent, it isn't sustainable long term. It is too much. It is too much burden of mental load. And you end up feeling like you're a caregiver to your spouse, like they are your dependent. And that's not sexy.
Yeah.
Yes. And so that is one of the main roles, because for a lot of the women, so I'm going to specifically, while of course there can be neurodiverse men and women, specifically for the non-autistic spouse married to the autistic male spouse. And that's what it's like. I feel like a mom, a caregiver. Like, I get that I can accommodate and make some modifications, that we can come up with a plan or a system for executive function. But if I'm in mommy naggy mode, that is also a turn off. So, like, first of all, like, let your yes be yes and your no be no. And then if there's an executive function issue, ADHD or autism, let's figure out a schedule, a system, prompts, a cork board, a whiteboard, sticky notes. Like, I'm in that. I'll help you with that. But then you've got to follow through and do the thing. Your autism or ADHD is not your reason to get to not do that because you decided on Tuesday fly fishing for 6 hours was better, when you had an agreement and a promise that this was what you were going to do, and you woke up with an impulse to, get up before all of the rest of us were up, and you went and, fly fished. And what about all the things that we were supposed, to do and get accomplished? And that I thought was super important. You didn't really address all of neurodiversity, like we said, but at least on the book that I have like a manuscript copy on 150. It talks about, you even looked at ADHD women and ADHD men, and still, the ADHD women needed less prompting. So you said respectfully, I believe, that ADHD then is not the only issue at play. People cannot use a diagnosis as a reason not to have to fully show up in their marriage. So I was like, yes, the singleness test. So talk about the singleness test, because that was another time I was going like, yes, yes, yes. So talk about that.
Well, it's just a very practical way of knowing whether you're it's appropriate. Is if you were on your own, would you have to sort this out? And if you would have to sort this out on your own, then you need to put the accommodations in place to get it done. But if it's honestly something you couldn't do on your own, then it's okay to say to your spouse, I need help with this. I can't manage this by myself. And it's sort of a quick test. Because the two sides of the road you can follow, the ditch on either side you can fall into, is the one we've been talking about, which is trying to use it as a free pass. So I have this issue, so I don't have to do any housework, But the other side too is to actually not be understanding enough that there is a problem here, and you do have to give some accommodations. But there's a difference between accommodation and saying, free pass. Those are very different things.
Yeah. And I mean, yeah, like if you were at home, you would have to figure out how to do laundry. You would have to figure out how to make sure that you got to your doctor's appointments and that you made periodic dentist appointments, right? You would have to figure out, oh gosh, my mom's birthday's coming. I need to get her a birthday card. Yep. Like you would have to keep track of the different relationships in your family, unless you wanted to not have any relationships at all. But there are things that you would have to do if you were single. And so you don't get to stop doing those things just because you're married. Once you're married, we're going to have negotiations, and we're going to say, okay, who's going to be responsible for what? But you don't get to stop things altogether.
And one of the things too is that the societal consequences are different for men and for women. So if a house is not tidy, just the reality of the matter is that people usually say, well, what's wrong with that wife that she's not keeping the house clean, even if she's the main income earner and he's at home more than she is. That's just the reality of our society. So I think that men can often, without meaning to, drift into getting away with things that we wouldn't let women get away with. And I'm not trying to bash men, but that's the reality of the matter. And that's what we talked about with the ADHD stats. Both ADHD men and women have troubles. Women cope better than men because we make them. So, see it not as attacking men, guys, but see it as me saying, we believe you can do it, but you do have to step up and say, I'm going to work at this. I'm not going to be perfect when I start, but I'm not going to give up just because I'm not perfect at the start. I'm going to keep trying to show up, being more present, developing the skills so that I can be a true partner in my marriage, despite whatever challenges I have.
Yep. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that was part of the things that, Dan didn't understand because it was work and he was and his own neurodiversity. What I did, I don't remember if it was like little sticky notes or cards, but I kind of wrote down like all the things that I was doing and put it on the table, and things like making appointments, dental appointments, and our situation going to IEP meetings, which take up long times of the day when you're dealing with a public school, church stuff, volunteer stuff, the kids need stuff for a project or a party, all these little things that aren't like a put it on a chore list thing, but it comes up from week to week. And usually, not always, mom, wife is handling those things and may or may not be working outside of the home. And even if she's homeschooling, she's still working a full-time job. Some of the men that I talk with are like, this house should be cleaner. She homeschools. I'm like, but her and the kids are in it all day. It's hard to keep a house clean when there are children in it all day and not at school, 6 hours a day. So there's like, what are you thinking the house is going to look like a museum when you come home when they have literally been home all day schooling? I don't understand that concept. But that Dan had to really see it, of all the different things I was doing that he wasn't aware of, because he just didn't. We kind of joke about the fairies did it. And I was like, fairy, I'm the fairy. I'm the fairy doing the things. So this fairy needs a break. So that just totally looking at, so for neurodiverse couples, I would say you could start with, first of all, what are the things that are your skill sets first, more than your gender roles? So what are the skills that you already have that are strengths that might be a certain chore? And what are ones you might actually like? Like back then, I liked cleaning the toilet because it was a stress thing. It was a stress relief thing, right?
Yes.
But I hated cooking.
I'm with you.
Right. So Dan took over the cooking and I was like, I'm happy to do the bathrooms or whatever. And we have 2 girls and I'm probably going to be doing bathing more with them because we had girl children, not male children. So things like what works in your system, how every family is a different system that works in a different way. So where's your strength? What do you like to do? What works with your system? And then you divvy up the rest, like in grown up world, maybe things I don't like to do, but I've got to, adult and figure it out. Or maybe it is accommodation, like you're saying, Keith, that is something this person wasn't doing when they were single, couldn't figure that out. Even mom said, yep, that was a problem when they lived at home. It wasn't being enabling. It was like, no, this was a problem. And this is how we had to, solve the problem. That's how we want to look at this. So talk about a little bit about how emotional and mental load kind of affect this responsibility and dependability thing, Sheila. Like what is some of the stuff from the book that you remember from the study about that?
Well, what I want people to understand is something that we call the unfairness threshold. Okay. And when you look over time, people are often able to put up with something that's unfair for about 10 years, but then by year 15, they're losing it. And by year 20, they've had it. And so what year were you at when you sat down with Dan and said, I'm not coping, I'm at the end of my rope?
That was about year 10 to 12. That was in that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really common. And we see it much more with women than with men. So we took a look, we plotted both men and women on graphs, and it really did seem like unfairness is like compounded with women, because it's often unfairness in multiple different areas of their lives. And over the course of 20 years, things that they could put up with in the honeymoon stage, this is now our marriage is in serious trouble. So for instance, if you ask women who do more than 75% of the housework, if you ask them in the first year of marriage, does your spouse do his fair share? The majority of women say, oh, yes, he does. Even at 5 years, most women say, oh, yes. But at 10 years, we're starting to see a real dip. At 15 years, we're seeing a massive dip. And at 20 years, we're saying, so he's doing the same amount of housework and she's doing the same amount of housework, but she's seeing it very differently at year 20 than she did at year 1 or at year 5. And we see that for multiple things. It's true with housework. It's true with things like who is going to do the repair in our marriage when there's a rift between us. So when we've had a fight, who is the first one to try to bridge that gap and say, hey, let's figure this out. I'm sorry for how I spoke. What are we going to do going forward? If one spouse bears that, they can put up with it for 5 years. They can't put up with it for 20. Or if you look at in-laws, okay, you mentioned in-laws earlier. When we asked couples, okay, who looks after your mother's birthday? right? Who looks after your family of origin? If there's something that comes up, who looks after it? And in about 50% of couples, they each look after their own. And the other, she looks after it for both of them. There's very, very few where he looks after it for both of them. So in those marriages where she looks after it for both of them, she can put up with it for 5 years. She can't put up with it for 20. And we see this over and over and over again. Same with sex. If she's not orgasming, doesn't bother her in the first 5 years, it seriously bothers her by 20, and sex and your marriage basically goes sexless. So it's like there is this unfairness that builds up over time. And so if you're at year 6 and you're thinking to yourself, well, this isn't that bad. No, do something now, because you're not going to be able to sustain this forever. And it's so much better to nip it in the bud early.
So I'm going to add on to your 20 years that in our research, we found that most of the men who were diagnosed over the age of 40. All right. So that's about 15 to 20 years into the marriage, and some kids or teenagers are there. And so in addition to this unfairness threshold, there is all this other lack of connection, lack of intimacy, all the good things that are supposed to be there aren't there either. So it's about at 15 and 20 years that the marriage is in